welcome to Saturday Night at the Movies, the podcast that celebrates classic cult and current films and the people that made them, many other aspects of pop culture. I'm your host, Steve Rubin. Our producer's Ben Shrewsbury, and our signature theme was composed by Greg Lerhoff. Here it's always Saturday night, and our mission is to chronicle film and pop cultural history one memory at a time. Tonight we feature a second return, or actually a third time, I'm not sure if a second return is appropriate, of one of our favorite guests, Errol Flynn historian and author Robert Florczak, whose book Errol Flynn, The Illustrated Life Chronology, is one of the most gorgeous coffee table film books ever published, let alone the ultimate reference source for everything Errol Flynn. Tonight's focus will be on the celebrated actor's final decade, leading to his untimely death in 1959 at the age of 50. Welcome back, Robert.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's great to be back for a third time. Is that how we counted it?
Yes, yes,
Three
yes.
times.
I guess your first return would
Uh-huh.
be your first return, and your second return would be your second return. But I think we don't need to get caught in the
Yeah,
weeds here.
yeah,
What's
yeah.
what I know that, by the way, if anybody hasn't picked up this book, it's literally the day-by-day life of Errol Flynn with enough detail to stuff a horse. I mean, you learn everything that could possibly be about, and you referenced so many letters, so you had access to a lot of original material directly from Flynn himself.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. This was the culmination of 10 years of collecting and putting things together like this, which didn't start out with the idea of a book. It was more of a hobby. And at the point I decided to make it into a legitimate book, I realized all this material was so valuable for putting a book of this sort together. So I was pretty lucky. And I was also lucky with the subject because not only does his does his life almost warrant three different episodes on your show because there's so much there, but just by I don't know, but just by sheer chance, there is a lot of information out there, including before he became famous. I was shocked about that when I started diving into all of the research material from the South Pacific. I was finding news articles that would have him in them, and he wasn't even famous yet. So I don't know how many other Hollywood celebrities from that time period, anyway, would have that kind of coverage.
He was in America for so long, we almost think of him as a Yank. But
Yeah.
his ethnicity is well, he was born in Australia or he was born in Tasmania.
Well, Tasmania is a state of Australia.
Okay.
So he was Australian, and I have to clarify this for myself. I just came across something that said that a someone from Australia would not be considered from the UK, and I'm always assuming that Australia was at least at some time was under the flag of Britain. So I don't know what those technicalities are, but I think of him as a Brit originally, and then he did become an American citizen in 1942.
Well, certainly one of our most illustrious and definitely demands a third visit and probably a fourth and fifth down the line because we'll focus on some films we can devote a whole hour to.
Oh, sure.
The final decade of Errol Flynn is a fairly turbulent one. In rereading portions of your book, I just got heavily into a lot of his issues with his various wives. And talk about a man who seemed to be the equivalent of some kind of Arabian prince with a harem. He just
Hmm.
constantly seemed to be involved with new and different women, and some of them, of course, caused him a great deal of trouble.
Oh, yeah.
I noticed in one of your passages that Lily Demita, who I believe was his first wife,
Yes,
was demanding more alimony. I guess she was the mother of Sean
that's
Flynn,
right.
who
That's right.
was mysteriously lost in Vietnam. He was a combat photographer, right?
Well, not combat, but he was a Time Life photographer, and he was on a project to do photography during the war in Southeast Asia there, and was captured at the Cambodian border and never
Is
seen
there
again.
is there definitive information on what happened to him, or is it really conjecture?
it's conjecture. There's even one person who has gone there and really dug deep to try to find information, and there really is none. It's just assumed he was probably executed, which is very
Right.
sad, very very sad.
Well, the decade of his last decade begins in the year 1950. And although we've talked about it before, I have to bring up my guilty pleasure movie because it is definitely my guilty pleasure movie,
Yeah,
Rocky
yeah.
Mountain, 1950.
Hmm.
Um, and I forgive me, audience, for digressing, but or repeating myself. I used to watch a TV show in LA back in the 60s called Saturday. It was called The Action Movie on one of the local channels, and they liked to run Rocky Mountain. And I became so familiar with the movie that during my bowling league, one day I walked into the bar, and what's on the TV is Rocky Mountain. And I'm explaining to a bunch of semi-drunk drunk bar patrons at 11 o'clock on a Saturday morning what this movie is about.
Yeah.
And if you haven't seen Rocky Mountain, I guess in the Flynn film oeuvre, or however you pronounce that, Rocky
Hmm.
Mountain is not considered one of his A-list titles,
No.
although it is for me. How would you classify it?
If I would uh, section off his film oeuvre into three parts, a top, a middle, middle so-so films, and then the ones at the bottom, which are not all that good. I would definitely put it in the second segment, in the middle
Right.
segment, and maybe near the top of that middle segment. He did about 55 films. So what does that come out to if you bisected that or trisected that?
About
But
eight,
it's a good
18,
film.
yeah,
Yeah,
18 films per section.
exactly, exactly,
Um,
and it's a good film. It's a
it is
good
a good
film.
film. It's for those of you who've not seen it, it takes place in March 1865, so only a month before the Civil War ends. But in the history of this thing, and although it claims to be based on an actual incident,
Right.
although what can you say about that? Well, the little marker that the modern car drives by at the beginning of the movie, before the movie begins, for real, but back in the 1860s shows a marker, a monument. I think that was created for the movie, if I'm not mistaken. Is there any
Yeah.
historical significance to this movie whatsoever?
Only the only material I've ever come across is itself not very definitive. They're not totally sure. And maybe when we do that trip together, Steve, out there, we maybe find some more information on it. But in the end, and you probably would agree, it doesn't matter that much because this is a piece of entertainment more than anything else. So
Of course, of course. The
yeah,
basic plot, for those of you who've not seen it, is that Errol Flynn plays Leif Barstow, a captain in the Confederate Army who leads a very small group. I think there are eight soldiers on horseback to California to meet with some irregulars led by a real desert rat named Cole Smith. And basically, they're going to try to turn California into a Confederate province and change the course of the war. These eight guys. So it basically, and it's a really eclectic group of guys. It includes one of the Flynn stalwarts, Gwyn Big Boy Williams. It's got Sheb Woolley in it, plays a
yeah,
real rascal,
right,
and,
right, right.
and some other really terrific actors. And they basically are there to meet with Cole Smith. And during the course of their first meeting, they notice that a stagecoach is being chased by Shoshones. And they rescue the two occupants, the driver and a very comely, beautiful blonde. Uh,
Hmm. How convenient.
how convenient, named Joanna Carter, played by Patrice Wymore, who
Right.
would shortly become the next Mrs. Errol Flynn.
And the third and
And
last. Yeah.
now, for me, the key to loving this movie, aside from the fact that it played for a million times on Action Movie, is the Max Steiner score. It's
Oh
one
yeah.
of Max Steiner's best scores. Not one that gets a lot of attention, but it's one that deserves the attention. And the ending of the movie, and I won't give it away here because it has one of the most dramatic endings for any Errol Flynn film.
Yeah.
And it's an action-packed ending. And I should also mention Scott Forbes in it, who plays Patrice Wymore's character, Joanna Carter's fiance.
Right.
And a really terrific film. I never get tired of it. And in fact, the audio cues, then there was an album that came out of Steiner Music, which includes a bunch of those cues. So you can't find this music.
Hmm.
So the 50s begin. Now I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because I had to do some catching up because there are a lot of film titles that
Yeah.
I'm not as familiar with. I might have seen them briefly, but I just didn't know them very well. So I'm going to put up a film called The Sun Also Rises,
Yeah.
which is basically Tyrone Power is the lead and Ava Gardner is in it, and uh, obviously Errol Flynn is in it. This is about the expatriates who live in Paris in the 20s, the so-called lost generation period where artists, writers, are hanging out and occasionally go down to watch the bullfights in Spain. And Errol Flynn plays a significant character in the piece, but he's mostly inebriated in the role. And it's funny because we'll talk about this after this because we'll talk about the roots of heaven. But at this period, uh, seems like alcohol occupied a very large portion of Errol Flynn's life. When had this begun, or was he always a drinker?
Oh, he was always a drinker, but it actually, we're talking about the 50s here, which is interesting because it's a single decade. And although he's probably slowing down, he was very busy in this decade, but his drinking became a problem much earlier on. You start to see it in my book, where I have a lot of inter-office memos. You'll see unit managers sending memos up to the front desk that they're having problems with him on the set as early as the mid 40s, I'm sorry. And then by 47 and 48, when he's doing another Western, he was doing uh, right before Don Juan also, he's really a problem. Silver River was the Western. And they were having to say he couldn't, he wasn't even allowed to leave the studio grounds for lunch during those periods because he would come back not only late but very drunk, and they couldn't get a good take out of him for the rest of the afternoon. So that was start. I mean, by 47 and 48, it's a serious problem. So here we're now. You're talking about literally 10 years later, because The Sun Also Rises is early 57, and
And this is a big movie. I mean, this is a
very
big
big,
studio movie for 20th Century Fox. It's Darryl F. Zanuck
right?
producing. Zanuck, I guess, had left Fox for a period and now comes back to Fox
Hmm.
to try to revive its fortunes with mixed results until he does The Longest Day in 62. But his
Yeah,
movies of the 50s are big and star-driven product, but
right.
not necessarily very successful. What can you tell us a little bit about The Sun Also Rises?
Well, he enjoyed doing that film, and it was supposed to be taking place in Spain, but was on location in Morelia, Mexico. And he was serious about the film. He did as good a job as he could. But probably more than likely, I mean, he plays the drunk character and does it well. He got great reviews on it, but more than likely, he was himself at least tipsy, if not drunk, during the actual filming of that. But he was very happy with the results, and there was a brief moment when it was announced that he might be up for an Academy Award for his acting role in that, and it didn't come true. But that's how good others were assessing his performance in that.
Well, for those of you who can see the YouTube, and for those of you who can't because you're listening to audio, I've thrown up a picture of Tyrone Power and Errol Flynn sitting together, looking at each other while they're having. I think Errol's having a beer.
Hmm.
Um, I thought to myself, Tyrone Power and Errol Flynn, two swashbuckling actors who had similar careers in many ways, although
Right.
I would think that Tyrone stretched himself a little bit more with drama.
Yeah.
Um, both died the same year. Both died in 59. Errol obviously succumbed at the end of the year, and then Tyrone Power was on the set of Solomon and Sheba and suffered a fatal heart attack.
Right.
But I thought irony, and of course, this is also the same year that Humphrey Bogart passed away. So we lost three legends in one year. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall listening to a conversation between Ty and
Hmm.
Errol. I may have mentioned this before that when I first came out to California, we were living in Chicago, and when it came out to visit relatives, I was at the LA International Airport, and I was walking through the airport with my mother and father, and my mother bumps into Tyrone Power. And
Really?
Tyrone Power looks at me in this little cute car coat. I'm like two or three, lifts me up in his arms,
Wow.
and I'm being swaddled by effing Tyrone Power. And
Nice.
my mother recalls she was kind of floating at that moment. And of course, my father was kind of staring daggers at her.
Yeah. I've
But
only been lucky enough to meet their daughters. I met Tyrone's daughter, and of course Errol's daughter, who was kind of helpful with my book. I think he and Bogart died a year or two earlier, because I know Flynn was at uh, Bogart's funeral.
right,
Um,
right.
and there's a and but the sad thing about Tyrone Power, I think he was only 44 when he died,
I know. I
uh, which
um,
is like 6 years younger even than Flynn.
you think that if they had modern medical rescue equipment in Spain
Hmm.
that year, they might have saved his life, especially for heart attack victims. Um,
And
I,
there's
I,
evidently film of that, because he had the heart attack during filming.
oh God.
I don't know if it's ever been shown or released anywhere. I've seen what is supposed to be a still photo of that event, and he's still obviously alive and conscious and all of that. But it's a very sad and
Very
terrible
sad
story.
ending. Very sad ending. I love, of course, one of my all-time favorite films is The Adventures of Robin Hood, but 2 years later, Tyrone Power does The Mark of Zorro, which
Yes.
I have equal love for,
Oh,
and
yeah.
it's Korngold's score for Robin Hood, which is of course is classic times 10, and then you've got Alfred Newman's score
Yeah.
for Mark of Zorro, which is also times 10. So yeah, no,
Fantastic.
that definitely. Is both high points. Now, one of the more interesting films that Flynn did turned out to be essentially his last major studio release. And I'm going to put it up right now. It's a nice shot
There
of him.
it
I
is.
thought he looks
Yeah.
very good there. The Roots of Heaven. Roots of
Yep.
Heaven, it has an interesting history. It's a very much a movie way ahead of its time. I mean, this is
Hmm.
1958.
Yeah.
So we're talking, let's see, it's 67 years ago. And this movie is an environmental warning movie about with centering on the elephants of Africa. Trevor Howard plays a environmental activist who's trying to save the elephants of Africa in a huge message movie that seemed like something that should have been released in 2025.
Exactly. Exactly. And well shot. Uh, it's unfortunately a little slow and talky. Otherwise, I think it would have been a major film for John Huston. But as a result, it's little known today. I mean, it's beautifully shot. Again, great cast. Even Orson Welles is in it.
Yes, Moses.
Um,
But you know, it's interesting about the casting because Trevor Howard's certainly one of the great actors to come out of Britain. Very surprising, though, for him to play such a lead. Now, I think I read on IMDb that William Holden turned down the role. Now,
yeah,
William Holden would have been an interesting choice, not only because he had more star power, but William Holden also became a huge animal environmentalist with
yeah.
his game ranch in Africa. But I think that possibly what hurt the movie was the casting of the lead. I mean, Trevor did a great job,
Yes,
but they
yes,
probably could have used an actor of Holden's level at that time.
right. Yeah, they needed somebody that was similar to a younger Flynn, because I don't think we thought of Trevor Howard in particularly physical masculine roles like that. He was much more of an urbane character and great when he was in those kinds of films. I think that is part of it. Part of the buying or the ticket selling part of the whole enterprise that probably was hurt by that. But that would have been, I think that would have been very good with William Holden. Flynn
Um,
again playing. It's almost like he's redoing his role from The Sun Also Rises. I mean,
well,
basically,
there's some interesting parallels between The Sun Also Rises and The Roots of Heaven. Both films feature Daryl Zanuck's lover, Juliet Greco.
hmm
It plays somewhat a similar role in both films. Um, let's see who else. Eddie Albert pops up in
yep,
both films.
yep,
I think
that's right.
both films were written by Romain Gary, if I'm not mistaken. I think the writer he was writer on both films, and Zanuck. It seemed to have his little team of actors he liked to work with,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
so of course Herbert Lom is in this, and
Right. And Flynn's teenage girlfriend was
Beverly Adlin. I noticed in
right.
your book you actually have a still, and I was wondering what role she played, and I just watched this the other. Actually, I watched it last night, and yeah, she's that little moment in that during that party.
Yeah, they're dancing together, and she actually has a line. Somebody comes in the door, and she turns and says something like, "I haven't seen it in a few years." Something like, "Oh, look who's here," or something like that. But I'm sure Flynn
Bounced
was
her a line exactly.
he probably pushed them to allow her to have a line in the film.
So he was married to Patrice Wymore at that time, and they were obviously not spending a lot of time together because Flynn was always traveling, and he just to be he was like human Velcro. If there was a pretty girl in the room, she was attached to him within 15 minutes. And I guess he met Beverly. What was she, 15 or 16?
Yeah, she was 15. That if you backtrack a few months, he met when he was doing Too Much Too Soon, his last film for Warner's, where he played John Barrymore. One day on the set, he saw her walking on the lot and wanted to meet her, and she, very much like the two girls from the statutory rape trial, presented herself as much older than she was and came across that way. And he was interested and started up a relationship with her. Patrice wasn't around. She was still I think she was in Jamaica at the time while he was doing the film. So he was alone to be able to cultivate this new affair. And then she came back into town, and within a couple months, he realized that he was not going to be able to stay married anymore. And basically with the film we're talking about now, The Roots of Heaven, where he took off to Africa on location, that was his leaving of the marriage, his physical leaving of that marriage. And for the next 2 years, he basically didn't see her again until the last couple weeks of his life in Los Angeles.
Mm.
So that was his ending of his marriage, but continuing with Beverly Adeland right to the end.
I'm gonna put up a picture from let's see if I have a good picture of Too Much Too Soon.
Yeah,
Yes,
there you
with
go.
Dorothy Malone. Uh,
Mhm.
I thought it was interesting. There is a great story, and I think you'll confirm it, that when John Barrymore died, that a group of his friends got together, stole the corpse from the funeral home, brought him over to some. I don't know if they brought him over to Errol Flynn's house, but
Well,
there was.
Flynn told the story, it was brought up to his house, and then when he came home that night, he basically jumped out the window. But it's total mythology, total fabrication. There's, there's and several people who had been supposedly involved with that had even said so afterwards. There's no way we would have done that.
If I'm not mistaken, Blake Edwards recreated a version of that in a more modern setting for his movie SOB, I believe.
Yeah, I know of that film. I've never seen that before, but is there a scene like that in
I
there?
think so. I think so. They grab a friend of theirs who's just passed away, and they do kind of a wake like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
His
did
his, his
yeah.
Drew Barrymore has started to go around, starting about 2 years ago, claiming that through her family, she knows for a fact that that did happen. But I kind of wish you wouldn't do that because there is no evidence of anything like that. Not to mention the fact that it would be nearly impossible to do that from a funeral home. To they supposedly stole the body and put it in a station wagon and drove it up to his Mulholland house. You can't. I mean, that's a crime. And
I'm sure it's a crime. Now, interestingly, in your book, you talk about his drinking issues. He had major drinking issues on this movie. You have all the production reports,
oh yeah,
and the daily reports basically say that the footage is unusable because of his inebriation.
exactly. There's a wonderful memo from the director of Art Napoleon, sort of apologizing because as your viewers probably know from those days, you would see daily rushes. So Jack Warner or one of the major producers, Hal Wallace in the early days, would watch that day's footage, and trying to head things off at the pass before he was going to get clobbered. Art Napoleon had written that I want to let you know why all you're seeing are close-ups, because normally you want to shoot a long shot, a two shot, where you're seeing two people having a conversation, and then you go in and do your close-ups of each one over the shoulder, all of that. In the long shot, you usually do the whole set of dialogue. It could last for a couple minutes, maybe, and then you go in and do the close-ups, which are small portions of that dialogue. Well, the reason he said that the rushes that you're seeing are only close-ups is because Flynn could not handle long dialogue. So he could not do an extended scene of dialogue. It had to be all done in small portions because he could get two or three lines out and then completely forget, and they'd have to stop. In fact, he himself started to call cut, which is something actors don't do. You're not supposed to. I mean, that's what the director is supposed to do.
Isn't it? I think in one of those memos it stated that Napoleon would actually read the line and then
Yes,
Errol would do it one line at a time.
right. He'd
What a
repeat.
disaster.
It was very very sad. That's how bad he was, and that's late 1957. He still has another 2 years to live, so you can imagine how he's probably going downhill quite a bit from that point on.
Right, right.
And
No, of course.
it was
Now
very
I'm gonna
sad.
I'm gonna backtrack a little bit because I had forgotten that I wanted to mention a project, a favorite project of Flynn's that unfortunately never got finished, which
Hmm.
was the William Tell movie.
That's right.
Now,
Yeah.
the William Tell, who is the lady in this picture with him? Do you know who that is?
Um, yes, I do, and it's slipping my mind. She didn't do a heck of a lot of work that people would remember. I'm thinking Luana something, an Italian actress. Yeah.
Um, Talk a little about, if you could, about how this project originated. I mean, the story of William Tell. I mean, obviously we know about the William Tell Overture, a great musical composition, which I believe is it also the Lone Ranger theme? Am I confusing it? Dun, 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 dun.
Yeah, yeah, the William Tell Overture.
The
Right,
William Tell
right,
Overture, right? Of course,
right.
of course.
By the way, the name is Antonella Lualdi. Um,
I'm sorry. Say that one more time.
yeah, he had wanted to do this. Antonella Lualdi,
Okay, I'm having a little audio issue here. Hang on.
Italian actor.
Keep talking,
Can
Robert.
you
I'm
hear
having a little audio issue here.
me?
Um,
Let me know. It says internet connection
okay, you're good
unstable.
now.
Can
You're
is it
good now. You're good now.
okay?
Say your name one more.
Antonella Lualdi.
Okay, Antonella.
Antonella. Good. Um, he had wanted to do this project for quite a while. I mean, it's tailor made for him, and he was going to basically be producing it himself. And it was going to be dependent on Italian creditors who were going to be putting up, who were going to be matching his own uh, input, financial input. and he spent about $430,000 of his own money, which is the equivalent today of well over 5 million. And so with that, they started the film. And along the way, in the several weeks that they were filming up in northern Italy, the Italian investors were not ponying up with their side of it, and to the point of where he ran out of his own money, and that was the end of it. They had to just literally shut down the film, and it was such a terrible experience for him, and he so wanted to have that film come out. It was going to be, if it had come out, had been finished filming and come out in the proper amount of time, it would have been the first widescreen release of any film. That ended up going to the Robe when the Robe came out, but it was
1953, right, right.
yeah, yeah. Um, and he had to stop, and people were not paid their final payments on it, and it was a mess. And he was so into the project that I think, if I remember, I'd have to go back through my book again. As much as 4 or 5 years after this, he was still thinking he'd be able to finish this if he could just get the financing for it.
How much
And
of the film was in the can?
I think only about a half hour.
Oh,
About a half hour film, and gorgeous. It was filmed up in Courmayeur. I've been up there. They built a village, an alpine village, where the frontages, at least, were in stone, and some of those buildings are still there. It's a
what
kind of a
what country is that?
It's in Italy. It's in the Italian Alps, in the very north of Italy, near Switzerland, in a skiing town called Courmayeur. And about 10 miles outside of the town is that little village where they did most of the filming, the extant filming, and in another area called Blue Lake. And that was it. And they just had to let everybody go, unfortunately.
What is the ethnicity of the William Tell character? Is he supposed to be a Scandinavian character,
No,
or
I think it's Swiss. I think he's Swiss.
he's Swiss?
Yeah, yeah.
Got it.
And it's the old fable about him and shooting the apple off his son's head.
Right, right. Are there
And
any other name actors in the piece that we would recognize?
well, his friend Bruce
Cabot,
Cabot
right?
was probably the only one that I can think of, and as a result of that whole fiasco, they ended up not being friends, and Cabot ended up suing him, and it
Oh
was
God.
horrible. Although they did still do a few things together. They did a TV or a radio show, um, somewhat after this whole thing ended. So despite a lot of the mythology about those two being at each other's throats, which eventually it did get that way, because Flynn actually opens up his autobiography, My Wicked Wicked Ways, with a whole diatribe about him, about Bruce Cabot. But they stayed somewhat friendly afterwards. I suppose that Cabot was still thinking that he was going to get paid, his back pay on that, and then eventually it just never came through.
For those of you who don't know who Bruce Cabot is, he's Fay Wray's boyfriend in the original King Kong,
Right.
and works all the way through several decades. I always remember him as the second lieutenant to the Willard White character in Diamonds Are Forever, the James Bond movie.
Hmm.
He plays a character named Bert Saxby, where he ends up taking a shot at James Bond, who shoots him. And the Willard White character, played wonderfully by Jimmy Dean, says, "Bert Saxby, tell him he's fired."
He also starred opposite Flynn in Dodge City as the villain.
Oh, there you
Uh,
go. There you
so
go.
they went back a long way with each other.
Well, by the way, in rereading and reading these portions of your book over again, I realized how much television Errol was doing. It's funny, over the years, there was this
Mhm.
theory that movie actors just did not do television, especially in the 1950s when TV was competing with the studios.
Yeah,
But I'm reading your book and hearing that he's doing game shows,
that's
and
right.
he's doing a million talk shows. It's funny. One of my favorite comedies is the 1980 film My Favorite Year with Peter
Right,
O'Toole.
right.
And I
Yeah,
guess in many ways, Peter O'Toole is playing an Errol Flynn type
that's
character.
right. Right.
Uh, was there what was he ever doing a live variety show like that? Did you have any recollection
Well,
of that?
he did a number of them. As I recall, that film is loosely based on Sid Caesar
Right.
working for what was the show that he did with the other comedians?
Your
Um,
show of shows?
I think it was your show of shows,
Right.
and Flynn is supposed to, well, um, O'Toole is a guest on that week's show, and supposedly it's based on an experience like that. I know I came across once a quote from, of all people, Don Knotts, who came out of those shows also, and he remembering uh, Flynn on one of the episodes and coming across him where it was a very sad scene where Flynn was just sitting on the steps, off on the side of the stages and just by himself, and he just seemed so alone. And went up to him and had a conversation. So there are connections there.
Sure.
Flynn did a lot of television. He was on the Abbott and Costello program that they
Well,
had.
he also did his own show, the Errol Flynn Show.
Right, that was out of England. He had a deal there, an episodic weekly thing that went on for a year, and it was fairly successful. It wasn't shown in the United States, but he jumped in partly because he just wasn't getting the work he wanted.
Right, right.
His
The parts in the sun also rises and Roots of Heaven were not as prevalent. Um, the um, the last part of your book prior to his death is this whole Cuban thing. Now,
Yeah,
I found it quite fascinating that Errol Flynn goes to Cuba during the Cuban Revolution,
right.
and before the Batista government falls, he's actually with Castro. How
Was
did that come about?
Well, he was with Batista at first. I think I have a photo of him with Batista before that. First of all, to explain that, why he would be visiting Batista and then also visiting Castro, he always wanted to be where the action was. And that goes back, not only does that go back to his days in the South Pacific, wanting to do all the exciting things there, but leaving Hollywood in 37 to go to the front of the Spanish Civil War, wanting to see things up front for himself. So he found the whole thing fascinating. It sounded very glorious. And those at that point in 1958, you can find this even in the U.S. People were sort of enamored with Castro. He did not come forward yet and fully admit that he was a communist. He sounded like to a lot of the people in the West, although it was Caribbean, as someone who was trying to fight against the corruption of the Batista government. And, he had a lot of supporters in America for that kind of thing. And it was only later on, after he had um, uh, toppled the Batista regime, that it started coming out what he really was all about. And in fact, Flynn did meet with him. He actually went up into the hills where Castro and his band of supporters were, and met him face to face. I have a picture of them together in the book. He comes back to the U.S. after that, and is on the Jack Parr show, talking. He had just arrived like the day before or something from Cuba, and is talking about this whole thing. He was on a few shows actually, and talking very highly of Castro. Within a short time, in the same period of time, basically, that most people in the West started to realize what was really going on, he himself retracted his position on Castro. So he got the message
The
too.
the uh, the fact that he might have been slightly wounded by a bullet ricochet, do you think that was fabricated?
Probably not. I mean, he was right in the midst of things in Havana going on. There was some real heavy rebel fighting going on, and he was trying to get from one place to another. And he claimed that he got hit with some plaster shrapnel, that a bullet had hit a wall that he was near, and it hit him in the leg or whatever. And it was probably, could be, but he also, by that point, he knew how to milk his activities to get as much press as possible. So who knows?
I want to go back to the Roots of Heaven for a second,
Mhm.
because one of the things that I learned from your book was how difficult the shoot was. Apparently, almost everybody got sick except for Errol and John Huston, the director, because they were consuming prodigious amounts of alcohol.
Right, that's right. The theory is, if you know, and it's still the case in many ways today. If you go to certain areas of the world, you're not supposed to drink the local water. And you know, at least for Flynn, being the alcoholic he was, he had no use for water. He just went right to the gin and the vodka, and that
Sauce.
and the theory is that's what kind of saved him. I think Beverly got pretty sick too. So,
Beverly got
uh,
sick, Juliet Greco, Eddie Albert. I mean,
oh yeah.
just the way it was described, the average temperature in French Equatorial Africa, where they were
Mhm.
shooting, was like 125 by the day and 95 at
Yeah,
night. It sounds awful.
it was brutal. But you know, keep in mind also, he was not that was not an unfamiliar environment for him because having come up from tropical South Pacific and
Right.
all those years in New Guinea, he knew what that kind of weather was all about. Not that he would want to be in it, but you know, the others were Hollywood types, and they were not necessarily familiar with that.
By the way, in reading about Kim, which she does earlier in the 50s, which
Hmm.
another is really more of a supporting part for him. You
Hmm.
mention, or you mentioned in one of the reports, that even though he went to India to
Hmm.
shoot some footage, very little ended up in the film. I was surprised that MGM would take a crew to India as early as this film was being shot, because the general feeling in Hollywood is you shot on sound stages or you
Well,
shot, at Lone
uh,
Pine.
yeah, let me clarify that. It was shot there, and there is a lot of India in the film. What I discovered in really looking into this, and write in my book, is that there is only one shot, and possibly a second one, of Flynn in India that is used in the film. And that's amazing in and of itself. I mean, he wanted to go to India, and he got his chance to do that, of course. But as far as the film is concerned, they used almost nothing of whatever they might have filmed of him on location. There's a lot of location work in the
Right,
movie
right.
from
And,
India.
and matching the locations at Lone Pine, which apparently were pretty good.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, Flynn's final film was a bit of an oddity. Cuban Rebel Girls.
Hmm.
Um, he doesn't look too good in this picture, which I've portrayed. Of course, he dies shortly after the film was finished. What do you know about this film?
This was a pet project of his, and it really is sad. I mean, I try to give him the benefit of the doubt on his lesser films, the films that would be in that third bottom
Right,
section we were talking about. But this one, you really can't give it much. And yet, he's so promoting of this film when it's done. You wonder, did he really believe this was a great film from everything you read him talking about it? Or was he just, trying to get the thing up and out there as best he could so he can make his money back on it? But it's a terrible piece of film. That sweater shirt that you see him wearing there, he practically wore that daily for the last year of his life. He just was always in something like that. He was this was not a good project, sadly.
now, his death comes shortly thereafter. The There was some reference in your book to the fact that he might have been shooting heroin, and that might have caused his death. I'm sure his liver was probably not functioning much anymore, and probably caused part of his death. What's the story on what caused Errol Flynn's death from your point of view?
Well, I mean, he simply died as a result of the accumulation of all the years of alcohol and cigarettes. The drug use is really hard to uh, prove. I mean, he did dabble in things. Even Nora Eddington, his second wife, mentions that he would dabble in different drugs and everything. But frankly, I don't think that was his major problem. It was mostly the alcohol, and you have to remember also this guy, he was smoking 5 packs of cigarettes a day.
Oh my
Uh,
God.
when you see photos in that last decade, he's never without a cigarette. He's constantly, and those are the days before filters even. So that's 100 cigarettes a day. You can hear it. Something happens to his voice in the early 50s that I've noticed. He had this mellifluous voice in the early days, and then it starts to get uh, very hollow and deep, and it seems like his sinuses are resonating in his voice, and it's not a pleasant thing anymore. It's really almost like a different person's voice.
Well, it's
And
funny you should mention that because watching the first few moments of his appearance in The Sun Also Rises, I'm listening to Errol's voice and it doesn't sound like him.
no, no, it's a different voice, and along with that, you start hearing his labored breathing. He's always taking deep breaths as speaking in those later films, and that's all part of it. And yet, what's interesting, and I do point this out in the book, is right up almost to the day he died, he was still doing physically adventurous things. He would be down in Jamaica in that last year of his life and doing deep sea diving. And he would come up for air, practically, dying of asphyxiation, but just thrilled at what he found down at the bottom of the sea there. Most people who were in the physical condition he was in then in the late 50s would be sitting at home in a rocking chair and watching TV
Oh
shows.
yeah.
They would want to
Well,
expend the energy.
well, he certainly wasn't wasting away. If anything, he was becoming fuller and, more jowly but Errol Flynn, I have to thank you for putting together this great book and really your work in piecing together such a vast amount of material that really gives us a blow by blow account of his. And we should study Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn was a very unique actor at a
Mhm.
time when there were many swashbucklers, but
Yeah.
he was certainly a cut above them all. Um, except Ty Power. They were pretty close. But the thing is, I think we could use a few more Errol Flynns today. I mean,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
fact is that he was very much a product of the studio system investing in his career and
Right.
providing him with a steady stream of great projects.
Right. Well, I don't know if we'll find the same today. And I've said this so many times, I'll say it again. The main reason that he stands out is because regarding those heroic roles, they were authentic because he himself had lived a unique life of adventure and danger, which you don't usually find, especially today. If you have a great actor who does adventurous roles, they have gone to film class, acting classes, and they live in Los Angeles and keep their daily calendar of meetings that they're having and all that. Flynn, at the same time in his life, was fighting headhunters and having his boats sink off of Port Moresby and that kind of thing. So when you finally saw this guy on the screen, you're seeing somebody who could draw from those life experiences to imbue his characters with authenticity rather than just an actor fantasizing it and making it up.
So Robert, for the people who are not familiar with Errol, who are younger perhaps on this broadcast, give them three movies that define Errol Flynn.
Okay. Well, top of the list, of course, is The Adventures of Robin Hood, which I can probably clear out a cocktail party, proving why I think it's the greatest film Hollywood ever produced on all levels, not just because Errol Flynn was in it. Um, I think Gentleman Jim would be another. That was his personal favorite, the true story of James Corbett, the great boxer. So something a little different there. And I might include Objective Burma, which would
Oh
be
yeah.
a terrific war film. And those three films, all somewhat physically adventurous, are all different from each other. Objective Burma is a great World War II movie that takes place in Southeast Asia, and just a terrific film.
Oh yeah. I'll throw in The Charge of the Light Brigade, one of
Oh
my
yeah,
personal favorites. And then just 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 to throw it in there because it never gets mentioned. Rocky Mountain.
Rocky Mountain. Well, let me ask you something before we go. I usually I love black and white film. There are films that should not be in color.
Right.
When it comes to Flynn's films, the one that always comes up is that the Seahawk should have been in color, which it probably should have been. I sometimes wonder if it could have been a more successful film if Rocky Mountain were in color because of how beautifully it used the actual locations in New Mexico. How do you feel about that, since that's your film?
Um, I don't think so. I think that the black and white works for me because everybody I'd been used to seeing most of those guys in black and white.
Yeah.
I have it's funny we should mention black and white versus color. I did an encyclopedia of the Twilight Zone, the original five
Right.
seasons created by Rod Serling, and I often am asked about what about the renewed Twilight Zones. I say I can't watch a Twilight Zone in color.
I know.
Twilight Zones, 90% of the effectiveness of Twilight Zones is due to the atmosphere that Serling's team put together. And I also learned over the years that when you watch a movie in black and white, especially a fantasy or a science fiction film, it brings you to a world you're unfamiliar with. So you
Right.
take these Rod Serling stories that are so unusual and outrageous, you put them in black and white, it adds a level of mystery to the experience, making it more interesting. With
Right.
Rocky Mountain, that movie's not about so much the scenery as the
Mhm.
interplay of the characters and the desperate situation Errol Flynn's group of men are put into. Yeah, I would not want to see that in
You
color.
wouldn't.
I mean, there are some movies that have, the whole colorization process is kind of ridiculous. It just, the only time it ever worked a little tiny bit was a Jimmy Cagney movie about World War One, and I'm trying to remember the name of, oh, The Fighting
Saying
69.
69. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
a terrific World War One movie, and they colorized it a little bit because, there's not much color on a World War One battlefront. But for the most part, I don't like colorization.
I'll tell you what, you mentioned Charge of the Light Brigade. I would not want to see that in color.
No,
I
of course they remade it years later. I've never seen the remake. I
haven't
don't.
either. I sort of resist
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Well, we have been listening, as always, to a wonderful conversation with Robert Florczak. The book again is well, you tell them the title of the book. It's a long title.
Yeah, I forgot now.
It's the illustrated history of Errol Flynn. I mean, it's a gorgeous coffee table book. It weighs a ton, but every page, and by the way, the graphic design of the book is marvelous.
Thank
And
you.
by the way, are you working on anything as epic as your Errol Flynn film book at all? Have you found a
I
new
don't.
subject to
Yeah. I
pursue?
have a new book coming out in June. I don't know how epic it is, but it's close to my heart. It's a different subject. It's called Good Art, Bad Art: A Guide to Judging Quality. That you
Oh,
actually can judge the quality of artwork despite modern sensibilities that it's all subjective. So this is going to cause a little bit of commotion when this comes out.
well, we have been listening to a wonderful conversation with Robert Florczak. We're looking forward to your new book in June on art appreciation, etc.
Yeah.
And I want to thank you. I want to throw in a little plug for our other podcast, which is called Tales from Hollywoodland, which I co-host with Arthur E. Friedman and Julian Schlossberg, two fellow producers. You can find that just Google Tales from Hollywoodland. We talk about all sorts of show business subjects, often in a broader range. We talk about film genres. We do interview people, and it's a lot of fun. And we all have very specific opinions on things. I think you'll have fun with that. I'm always threatening to do a little singing, and they start yelling at me not to sing. And of course, I can't sing. I can't sing worth a lick, so it's probably a good thing. But I'm your host, Steve Rubin. Our producer is Ben Shrewsbury. You've been listening to and hopefully watching on YouTube Saturday Night at the Movies. Again, Robert, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, my absolute pleasure, Steve. And we can do it again.
Absolutely, and we will.
Yeah.